Welcome to another episode of Philosophy and Critical Thinking. This video is about the second night of John Perry's A Dialogue on Personal Identity and Immortality. Recall that at the end of the first night, Weyerhaeuser has been defending the bodily view and arguing against the soul view, and the last argument she entertained was the multiple soul hypothesis against the soul view. Weyerhaeuser doesn't really have anything to say about that argument in terms of a reasonable objection to think that it makes a mistake somewhere. So he kind of goes on the offensive. Rather than playing defense for the soul view, he's going to offer some criticism of the bodily view right at the beginning of the second night of the dialogue. His first argument against the bodily view is this. He says, you can tell who you are when you wake up first thing in the morning without even examining your body. You don't need to open your eyes and look around. You don't need to look in the mirror to check to see who you are. You can know who you are in this kind of first personal, intimate way. So if you can know who you are in the morning without having to first check your body, then judgments about sameness of person are not judgments about sameness of body. So you are not your body. You must be something else. His second argument against the bodily view is that it's possible to imagine yourself waking up inside of a different body. You can imagine a kind of Freaky Friday scenario where you wake up in the morning, you walk to the bathroom, you look in the mirror, and you have a totally different body and you're freaked out. All right, so that seems possible. And in such a scenario, you would have the same person without the same body. So it's possible to divorce the body from the person, so personal identity must not be the same thing as bodily identity. Okay, so those are some interesting arguments against the bodily view. If you think you might notice a problem with either argument, feel free to say so in the comments section below. In any case, the bodily view and the soul view, those are both versions of what are called substance views of personal identity. Substance views say that what personal identity is some underlying thing or substance, like a body or a soul, right? Where the body is a physical substance, the soul is a non-physical substance. What Miller is going to suggest next is that maybe personal identity should be thought of in relational terms rather than in terms of substance. Right? So in addition to the substance views, there are also what are called relational views. And a relational view just says that to be the same person over time is to be related in the right way to past and future stages of a person. So here's an analogy to think about before we move on to relational views of personal identity. Think about what it is to be the same baseball game over time. What makes two snapshots of a baseball game snapshots of the same baseball game has nothing to do with the players on the field or the field being the same field or the time at which the game is played. What it is to be the same baseball game has more to do with these things, the players, the plays, being related in the right kind of way to make up a whole game. So the baseball game really just is made up of parts that are connected in the right way. The innings have to be connected to one another in the right way. So does the score, so does the batting order. All of these things have to carry over from earlier innings to later innings according to the rules of the game in order to be the same game over time. Because after all, you could substitute a player in for another player and it's still the same game, right? So there's no specific player on the field that's essential to making this the same game. You can move the game to a different field. Maybe it starts pouring down rain on the initial field, and maybe the game needs to be postponed. So it doesn't matter that it's played today rather than tomorrow. It can be moved to tomorrow, and it can be moved to a different field. Right? And again, the players can be substituted in and out. So it's not the players, the field, or the time that matter here. What matters is that the parts of the game are related in the right way. So that would be a kind of relational view of what it is to be the same baseball game over time. Maybe what it is to be the same person over time is kind of like that, where a person is just a whole made up of parts that we could call person stages. And then as long as the person stages are related in the right way, you have the same person over time. This is basically what 17th century philosopher John Locke argued for in his essay on human understanding. Later person stages are related to earlier person stages by, Locke says, memory. So as long as the later person stages remember things that the earlier person stages did or thought, then they would be the same person. This is often called the memory view of personal identity, and it's a version of what can more generally be called a psychological continuity view. So the psychological continuity view just says that you're the same person over time, just in case your later person stages are psychologically continuous with earlier person stages. So the memory view just says that the only relevant psychological criterion here is memory. Memory is the thread that can tie the person stages together. But, there are other possible views out there. Maybe more than memory is required. So maybe you have to have continuity of personality over time, or continuity of beliefs over time. Who knows? It could be any other kind of psychological thing. But the memory view is the most prominent version of this psychological continuity view of personal identity. All right. Could that view be true? Could it be that you are just a person stage tied to your earlier person stages, so you when you were, say, 15 or 10 or 5, because you remember things that those earlier person stages did and thought? Here's a problem for the memory view. So Weyerab responds to Miller's suggestion that the memory view might be true by arguing that the memory view ends up being circular. And to see this, we can first begin by appreciating the difference between actually remembering something and then merely seeming to remember something, but not actually remembering it. So I'm sure many of you have had this experience before where you think you remember something, but you don't actually remember it. Right? Maybe you try to check with people around you. Did this actually happen? Or was that just some dream I had? Or is my mind just making things up? And so I've had this experience before where I thought that I had done something in the past, and then it turns out that that was just a thing I did in a dream. Not all of our memories that we have are genuine memories. Some of them are false. All right, so Weyerab asks, well, what exactly is the difference between actually remembering and seeming to remember? Well, it seems like the difference between the two is that if you actually remember doing something, then it was really you who did that thing. Right? If you didn't really do it, then you can't remember having done it. Whereas you can seem to remember having done something even if you didn't really do it. So it looks like genuine memory requires that the person who actually remembers is one and the same person, so is identical to the person who actually did the thing that they seem to remember doing. What does that mean? That means that in order to explain the difference between actually remembering and seeming to remember, we have to appeal to the concept of personal identity. But remember, the memory view is supposed to be the thing that explains to us what it is to be the same person over time. So we can't use the memory view to explain personal identity and then use personal identity to explain what it is to remember, having done something in the past. Otherwise, our explanation is circular and doesn't really end up explaining anything at all. Another way to put the basic point here is that doubts about surviving one's own bodily death could easily carry over to doubts about whether some heavenly person actually remembers or merely seems to remember being some person in the past. So from Wyrob's perspective, a heavenly person who looks like her or thinks like her might seem to remember having been Gretchen Wyrob in this life of hers. But does she actually remember? Or does she simply seem to remember and that's it? Well, we could doubt that she actually remembers. And so any doubts that one would have about the possibility of surviving bodily death could easily carry over to doubts about whether some heavenly person actually remembers or merely seems to remember having been a particular person on planet Earth. All right, the characters in the dialogue here start thinking about some really interesting scenarios at the end of the second night, scenarios having to do with brain duplication. So imagine, for example, the possibility that God creates a heavenly person whose brain is a duplicate of Wyrob's brain. And he creates the copy of Wyrob's brain, at the moment right before she dies. And God transfers all of the information in Wyrob's brain to the duplicated brain. Wouldn't this be a possibility that Wyrob can't rule out? And wouldn't this be a way of surviving her own bodily death? Wyrob says, well, if God could create one heavenly person like this with the duplicated brain and the duplicated information from Wyrob's head, then God could do it twice. He could make not only one clone, but two clones. Copy the information twice, and now we have two heavenly persons who possess the exactly same brain and the same information inside, and we can ask, well, which one is actually Wyrob? This example parallels an example offered by a philosopher named Derek Parfit, who worked a lot on personal identity, where he asked us to imagine a teletransporter that can break your body down molecule for molecule and send it off to a machine on some other planet, suppose it's on Mars, and the machine on the other planet reassembles the particles in exactly the same form as your body. So wouldn't this be a way of just transporting your body from one location to another? It sends the molecules off to Mars at nearly the speed of light. All right, well, if the machine could do that, all we have to imagine to make things weird is to imagine that the machine copying the molecules on the way over to Mars and then reassembling two versions of quote-unquote you. So there are two versions of you that walk out of the machine on Mars. And we can ask the question, well, which one is actually you? Of course, in both the, scenario where God creates two heavenly versions of you and this Parfit scenario where there are two versions of you on Mars, we can wonder, which one is actually you? Well, both of the individuals would remember being you because it's the same information inside of their heads. They would both look like you. So if we ask people who know you which one of them is you, they would be perplexed. They would be stumped. They wouldn't know. Is there a fact of the matter concerning which one is you, or do they both have an equal claim to being you? One thing that we shouldn't say is we shouldn't say that they're both you. And this is why we shouldn't say that. If we say they're both you, then we violate what's known as the transitivity of identity principle, which says if A is equal to B and B is equal to C, then A is equal to C. If we say that both individuals on Mars are you, then we violate this transitivity principle because they're clearly not identical to one another. I mean, one of them could walk over to East Mars, another could walk over to West Mars, and they could have different experiences on Mars. They're clearly not the same person. But if we say that they're both you, and the transitivity principle is true, then we must say that they themselves are also the same person, which they're clearly not. So the only way around this problem for surviving one's own bodily death would be to say that it's just impossible for there to be two versions of you on Mars. We would have to say that it's impossible for God to create two versions of you in a heavenly place. We'd have to say that God would somehow be limited to making only one such being. And there seems to be no reason at all to think that's true if we're imagining an all-powerful God who could do pretty much anything. So when we consider these cases of brain duplication in tandem with the memory view, it looks like it would be memory plus a kind of lack of competition with some other version of you that would be needed for personal identity. Right? So it wouldn't just be the states of your mind being the same over time or similar over time that would make you you, but the memory view would also require that certain other duplicates of you just don't exist. And the reason why that seems weird is that it certainly seems like personal identity is something intrinsic about you. Like whether you're the same person over time doesn't depend on other things external to you that are going on. If you're the same person over time, then what makes you the same person over time is just going to be some intrinsic thing about you, right? So personal identity would not depend on the existence or non-existence of some other person who is similar to you in some other place. Wyrob says, well, look at it from my point of view. God creates one of me in heaven. Surely I should be glad if convinced this was to happen. Now he creates another, and I should despair again, for this means I won't survive after all. How can doubling a good deed make it worthless? Suppose God created this heavenly person before I died. Then he in effect kills me. If he has already created her, then you really are not talking to whom you think. She's talking to Miller here, but someone new, created by Gretchen Wyrob's strange death moments ago. And so these are puzzling cases, these cases of brain duplication in tandem with the memory view, and they really stretch the limits of our concept of personal identity. So the philosopher Derek Parfit, who I mentioned earlier, suggested that what the cases show is that what really matters is psychological continuity over time. That's what really matters to us when we think about, the issue of why care about personal identity in the first place. It's really psychological continuity that matters, and that's the best we can do. But at the end of the day, says Parfit, there is no deeper thing that makes us the same person over time that would explain how we could, uniquely be the same person over time. There could be clones. And in those cases, the best that we could hope for is psychological continuity and nothing deeper than that. This is sometimes how things go in philosophy. You start with a concept like personal identity. You try to think about the various views and the arguments that would show those views to be true. And you might end up discovering that what you were initially looking for just isn't real or doesn't exist. But some kind of nearby idea or thing ends up being real. And in this case, it is possible to be psychologically continuous with a future self or a past self. Right? But maybe it's not the case that you are uniquely related to yourself in the sense that there could only ever be one version of you, and there's some underlying kind of substance that explains how you are the same thing over time. I should also mention that there are, in addition to the bodily view, the soul view, and the memory view, and other versions of the psychological continuity view, there are what are called no-self views of personal identity, which deny that that there is a person that persists through time. This idea comes up in many strands of Buddhist philosophy. Questions about the possibility of surviving one's own bodily death are presumably silenced by the no-self view. The answer is pretty obvious if the no-self view is true.